June 9th, 1982, 25,000 feet above the Bekaa Valley, Lebanon. The oppressive Mediterranean sun baked the cockpit of Lieutenant Adnan al-Hamad's MiG-23MF, and the recycled oxygen tasted stale through his mask. Below, the patchwork of green and brown earth was a chessboard for a war he barely understood. But up here, in the azure emptiness, he was a king. His Soviet instructors in Krasnodar had drilled it into him for 2 years. They had pushed his body to the edge of consciousness in the centrifuge, forced him to memorize the performance envelope of his flogger until it was an extension of his own soul, and filled his mind with the unshakable truth of Soviet air combat doctrine. The MiG was a warrior's aircraft, rugged, simple, brutally effective. It was designed for the turn, for the merge, for the moment a pilot's courage was tested in a swirling knife fight a mile wide. He and his wingman, flying in perfect, disciplined formation, were the product of a system that valued the human element, the sheer grit of the man in the machine. They were taught to fear the enemy's numbers, but never their technology. American fighters, they were told, were bloated with overly complex electronics, flown by soft, individualistic pilots who lacked the collective will to fight. They were gold-plated status symbols, not instruments of war. As Adnan scanned his radar scope, a flicker of green phosphor registered a contact, then another, then a dozen more. His heart hammered against his ribs, a familiar surge of adrenaline and training. The ground controller's voice crackled in his ear, calm and measured, directing his squadron toward the Israeli formation. This was it, the moment of truth. He prepared to jettison his external fuel tank, to push the throttle into afterburner and feel the kick of the Tumansky R-29 engine as he dove into the maelstrom. He pictured the American-made F-15 seconds, the Eagles his instructors had spoken of, with a mix of technical respect and ideological derision. He imagined pulling into a high G turn, forcing the heavier American fighter to bleed its energy, getting on its six, and hearing the satisfying growl of his Atoll missile locking onto the heat of its twin engines. But the merge never came. The sky in front of him remained empty. His radar screen was a chaotic mess of electronic noise, a storm of jamming he'd never experienced. The ground controller's voice was suddenly frantic, shouting conflicting commands. Adnan's head whipped from side to side, scanning the blindingly blue sky for a visual. Nothing. Then, his headset screamed with an electronic tone he'd only ever heard in simulations, the shrill, terrifying screech of a missile lock warning. He snapped the control stick hard left, his body crushed into his seat. But he had no idea what he was evading. He couldn't see the attacker. He couldn't see a missile trail. There was just the sound. A moment later, to his right, his wingman's MiG simply ceased to exist. It didn't trail smoke or spiral downwards. One instant it was a sleek, metallic shape against the sky. The next it was a silent, expanding fireball, a puff of orange and black that was instantly scattered by the wind. Adnan stared, his mind refusing to process the image. There was no dogfight. There was no maneuvering. There was no test of courage. There was only an invisible enemy and an instantaneous death. He was a master of a game that the enemy was no longer playing. In that moment of cold, stark terror, Lieutenant Adnan al-Hamad realized that everything he had been taught was a lie. The Soviet-trained pilots were stunned, their entire reality shattered in seconds by a weapon that defied their understanding of air combat. They couldn't believe what was happening, and the story of how American technology rewrote the rules of war is one of absolute dominance. If you want to see more stories about the moments that changed history, subscribe to WW2 Impact and join us on our journey into the past. To understand Adnan's shock, one must first understand the world he came from, a world built on the mythos of the Great Patriotic War. Soviet military doctrine was an ideology as much as a science, forged in the crucible of World War II's titanic Eastern Front. It was a philosophy of mass and grit, where victory was achieved by overwhelming numbers and the sheer resilience of the Russian soldier. This translated directly to their aviation design and tactics. The Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau, the legendary MiG, created fighters that were the airborne equivalent of the T-34 tank. They were simple to produce in massive numbers, easy for conscript pilots to maintain and fly, and optimized for a very specific type of combat. The MiG-21 and its successor, the MiG-23, were designed as point defense interceptors. They were meant to be guided by powerful ground-controlled intercept, or GCI, stations. A pilot was a component in a larger, centrally controlled system. He was told where to fly, what altitude to hold, and when to fire. The aircraft themselves were masterpieces of focused design, fast, agile in a turn, and armed for close-range combat. Soviet training was relentless and brutal, focused on physical endurance and rote memorization of maneuvers. Pilots were expected to be able to handle immense G-forces and to instinctively know how to win a turning fight, a swirling, close-quarters duel where victory went to the pilot, who could get his aircraft's nose pointed at the enemy's tail. Propaganda posters showed heroic Soviet pilots as eagles, soaring protectors of the motherland. Their instructors, many of them veterans of proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam, spoke of American opponents with contempt. American fighters like the F-4 Phantom were heavy, multi-role compromises, burdened with complex systems that frequently failed. American pilots, they argued, were products of a decadent capitalist society. They relied too much on their technology, lacked discipline, and when faced with a determined Soviet-trained adversary in a pure test of skill, they would inevitably be found wanting. This worldview was a comforting one. It placed the pilot, the human warrior, at the center of the universe, and it assured him that his courage and training would always triumph over a soulless machine. The Soviet bloc and its client states, like Syria, bought into this doctrine completely. They had the numbers, they had the rugged aircraft, and they had pilots who believed they were the heirs to a legacy of martial victory. But across the globe, in the sterile laboratories and wind tunnels of McDonnell Douglas Street, Louis, a completely different religion of air combat, had been perfected, born from its own traumatic wartime experience. During the Vietnam War, American pilots in their powerful F-4 Phantoms had been stunned by the agility of the much older, simpler North Vietnamese MiG-17 seconds and MiG-21 seconds. The Americans had superior speed and radar, but in the close-in, turning fights over Hanoi, their technological edge was often negated. This shock led to a revolution in American fighter design, spearheaded by a brilliant and abrasive Air Force colonel named John Boyd and his fighter mafia. Boyd developed what became known as energy maneuverability theory, a complex set of calculations that proved that victory in air combat wasn't just about turning radius or top speed. It was about the ability to gain or lose energy altitude and airspeed faster than your opponent. It was about dictating the terms of the fight. The F-15 Eagle was the physical embodiment of John Boyd's brutal mathematics. Its design mandate was simple and uncompromising. Not a pound for air to ground. It was not a bomber. It was not a multi-role compromise. It was built for one purpose, and one purpose only: to achieve and maintain absolute air superiority. To do this, it was given two massive Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines that produced so much thrust. The Eagle had a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1:1. This meant it could accelerate while climbing vertically, a feat that seemed to defy the laws of physics and left Soviet intelligence analysts in disbelief when they first learned of it. It was given a large, powerful Hughes APG 63 pulse Doppler radar, a system so advanced it could look down and distinguish a low-flying enemy fighter from the ground, clutter below a capability known as look-down, shoot-down that Soviet radars simply couldn't match. This radar allowed the F-15 pilot to see the enemy long before the enemy could see him. And to kill that enemy, it was armed with long-range radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrow missiles. An F-15 pilot wasn't trained to get into a turning fight. He was trained to avoid it entirely. The American policy was to achieve a first look, first shot, first kill. The goal was to destroy the enemy from beyond visual range, to win the battle before the opposing pilot even knew he was in one. The F-15's cockpit was another revolution, designed around the pilot. The high bubble canopy offered a 360-degree view with no obstructions, a stark contrast to the framed, often restrictive canopies of the MiGs. The controls and displays were designed to reduce pilot workload and increase situational awareness. Where the Soviet system saw the pilot as a cog in the machine, the American system saw the pilot as the commander of a weapons platform, an airborne tactician who was given the best information and the best tools to make life or death decisions. This wasn't just a new aircraft, it was a new philosophy. It was a philosophy that trusted technology, that leveraged immense industrial and scientific power, and that was about to be unleashed on an enemy who was still preparing for the last war. The build-up to the Baykar Valley turkey shoot, as it would later be known, began not in the sky, but in the sterile, air-conditioned command bunkers of the Syrian Arab Air Force. For weeks, tension had been escalating. Israeli ground forces had pushed into Lebanon, and Syria, as the self-proclaimed protector of the Arab world, was honor-bound to respond. The Syrian commanders, advised by their Soviet counterparts, were confident. They had established a formidable integrated air defense system in the Bekaa Valley, a layered network of SA-2, SA-3, and the new, supposedly invincible SA-6 gainful surface to air missile batteries. In the air, they held a numerical advantage. Squadrons of MiG 21 seconds and the more advanced variable sweep wing MiG 23 seconds were on high alert, their pilots eager to prove their mettle. From the Syrian perspective, the impending battle was one they were well prepared for. Their intelligence, heavily influenced by Soviet analysis, painted a picture of the Israeli Air Force as skilled but predictable. They would fly in low to avoid radar detection, just as they had in previous wars. They would be vulnerable to the dense thicket of SAMs. And any fighters that broke through would be met by Syrian MiGs, ready to engage in the classic dogfight where Syrian pilots believed their superior turning ability and sheer aggression would carry the day. They laughed at the F-15. Soviet intelligence reports, which were passed down to Syrian pilots, described the Eagle as a flying tennis court, a massive, unmaneuverable target. It was too big, too heavy. Its radar was powerful, yes, but it was also a massive beacon, screaming its location to every passive ESM receiver in the region. The Syrian pilots were briefed that if they could weather the first missile, a long-range shot they expected to be easily defeated with a hard turn, they could close the distance, and a new reality would emerge. Inside 10 nautical miles, the F-15 would be clumsy, its pilot disoriented by the chaos of a close-in fight. The MiG-23, with its swing wings adjusted for maximum agility, would dance around the lumbering giant. It was a compelling narrative, one that reinforced their entire training and ideology. When the first waves of Israeli aircraft were detected on June 9th, the Syrian response was textbook. GCI controllers began vectoring their fighter squadrons to intercept. Pilots like Lieutenant Adnan al-Hamad scrambled to their jets, their minds filled with images of heroic combat. They saw themselves as David facing Goliath, their nimble MiGs against the oversized American-made jets. There was a sense of excitement, of destiny. As they climbed towards the engagement altitude, their initial radar contacts seemed to confirm their expectations. There were dozens of enemy aircraft, but they were flying high, not low. A strange tactic, but one that made them even better targets for the SAM batteries below. The Syrian pilots pushed forward, confident that the invisible hand of their ground controllers and the lethal embrace of the SAM network would cripple the enemy formation before they even had to fire a shot. They were not just flying into a battle, they were flying into a carefully prepared trap of their own making, utterly oblivious to the fact that the enemy held a playbook they had never even conceived of. The moment of shock was not a single, explosive event, but a cascade of cognitive dissonance that shattered the Syrian pilots' reality in under 100 seconds. The first sign that something was profoundly wrong was the jamming. It wasn't the crude, brute-force noise jamming they had trained against. This was something different, something ethereal. Their radar screens, their primary window into the battle, dissolved into a blizzard of false targets and electronic snow. One moment they saw a dozen enemy contacts, the next they saw 200, then none at all. Their own ground controllers, the calm, authoritative voices that were supposed to be their gods in the sky, were suddenly screaming over the radio, their transmissions garbled and overlaid with strange electronic tones. The Syrian pilots were flying blind into a hurricane of invisible energy. Then came the sound. In the cockpit of a MiG-23, the RWR, or Radar Warning Receiver, was a simple but vital piece of equipment. It was designed to detect enemy radar signals and warn the pilot if he was being targeted. A low, intermittent chirp meant a search radar was sweeping the area. A steady tone meant a radar had locked on. The Syrian pilots began hearing the steady tone. The sound that meant death was looking for them, but it made no sense. They were still dozens of miles from the enemy formation, far beyond the effective range of the Israelis' short-range Sidewinder missiles. Their training insisted that the radar-guided Sparrows the F-15 seconds carried were easily defeated. Yet, the tone in their headsets was solid, insistent, and coming from multiple directions at once. Panic began to set in. They scanned the sky, a vast, empty expanse of blue. There were no enemy fighters, no smoke trails from launching missiles. Nothing. It was a ghost story come to life. They were being haunted by an invisible enemy. The first MiG exploded. Lieutenant Adnan al-Hamad saw it happen to his wingman. The jet, a 15-ton machine of steel and aluminum, simply vanished in a flash of light, replaced by a momentary, ugly black smudge. There was no warning, no chance to react. The Syrian squadron leader, a veteran of the 1973 war, frantically radioed his pilots to break formation and engage evasive maneuvers. But what were they evading? How do you dodge an enemy you cannot see? It was like trying to fight the wind. Another MiG exploded, then a third. The Syrian radio net descended into pure chaos screams, frantic calls for help, the chilling sound of open microphones, transmitting nothing but the roar of a jet engine followed by sudden, abrupt silence. The Syrian pilots, trained for a ballet of close-range combat, were being systematically executed from a distance, picked off like targets in a shooting gallery by marksmen they would never see. The F-15 pilots, orbiting miles away and thousands of feet above, were experiencing a completely different reality. Their powerful APG-63 radars cut through the Syrian, jamming like a searchlight through fog. On their displays, each MiG was a clear, unambiguous green symbol. They could see the Syrians' altitude, airspeed, and heading. Flying above them, an E-2C Hawkeye, an airborne command and control aircraft, acted as an all-seeing eye, coordinating the entire battle. The Israeli pilots were not lone wolves. They were a pack, seamlessly networked, sharing data and targeting information. An F-15 pilot would select a target on his screen, achieve a lock, and squeeze the trigger. Miles away, an AIM-7 Sparrow missile would drop from the Eagle's fuselage, its rocket motor igniting a split second later, accelerating it to over 4 times the speed of sound. The Syrian pilot's only warning was the final, terrifying screech of his RWR in the last few seconds of his life. For him, it was magic, a cruel and incomprehensible act of a vengeful god. For the F-15 pilot, it was a simple, almost sterile procedure, no different from the simulators they had trained in back in the Negev desert. The terror was entirely one-sided. The immediate aftermath was a stunned, panicked rout. The Syrian pilots, who had survived the initial volley of missiles, did the only thing they could. They broke off the engagement and fled. Pushing their throttles to the firewall, they dove for the relative safety of their own SAM envelope, the very missile shield that had been so conspicuously silent during the slaughter. The confident, aggressive warriors who had taken off less than 15 minutes earlier were now just terrified men, desperate to outrun an enemy they had never laid eyes on. On the Syrian radio frequencies, the screaming had been replaced by a deafening silence. The confident GCI controllers were gone, their screens likely as useless as the pilots. The only sounds were the strained breathing of panicked pilots and the lingering hum of their own aircraft systems. As they streaked back towards their airfields, they began to take a grim accounting. Squadron leaders called out for their wingmen and were met with silence. Of the nearly 60 Syrian MiGs that had risen to meet the Israelis, over a third had been destroyed in the first few minutes of the engagement, with 0 Israeli losses. 0. The number was impossible. In all of military history, such a lopsided outcome in a major aerial engagement was unheard of. It defied all logic, all principles of warfare they had ever been taught. As the surviving pilots landed, their hands shaking so badly they could barely unstrap themselves from their cockpits, the ground crews were shocked by what they saw. These were not the faces of men returning from battle. They were the faces of men who had seen a ghost. In the debriefing rooms, chaos reigned. Pilots tried to explain what had happened, but they had nothing to report. They had seen no enemies. They had engaged in no dogfights. They spoke of radar screens that went haywire, of phantom missile warnings, and of their comrades simply disappearing from the sky. The Syrian High Command and their Soviet advisors couldn't believe it. Their first assumption was that the pilots were lying, that they had panicked and fled at the first sign of a fight and were now inventing stories to cover their cowardice. It was the only explanation that made sense within their rigid worldview. But as more and more pilots from different squadrons returned with the exact same story, a horrifying new reality began to dawn. This was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of technology, of doctrine, of their entire understanding of modern air power. The indestructible SAM network in the Bekaa Valley had been systematically dismantled by Israeli electronic warfare and anti-radiation missiles in a coordinated attack that preceded the air battle. The ground controllers had been blinded, and the vaunted MiG fighters had been rendered utterly obsolete. The myth of the heroic dogfight, the core belief that had sustained Soviet-trained pilots for a generation, had been shattered in the skies over Lebanon. The game had changed, and they had just discovered they were no longer players. The Syrian Air Force's debacle over the Bekaa Valley was not a fluke, nor was it simply the result of better pilots or a slightly better aircraft. Soviet military analysts, in their desperate attempts to understand the catastrophe, initially tried to frame it that way. They blamed Syrian incompetence, a failure of nerve. But this was a comforting lie. The truth was far more terrifying for them. What had been unveiled was not just a new weapon, but a new paradigm of warfare. It was a fully integrated, networked system of destruction that operated on a plane of existence their own technology could not even perceive. This was the system that would become the new, brutal norm for any air force that dared to challenge American air power for the next 2 decades. They couldn't believe the totality of the system, a system designed not just to fight, but to make a fight impossible. The F-15 Eagle was merely the most visible component, the lethal tip of a very long spear. The true weapon was the network. High above the battlefield, lumbering E-2C Hawkeye aircraft served as the all-seeing eyes and brains of the operation. Their massive rotating radomes scanned hundreds of miles of airspace, tracking every single aircraft, friend and foe alike. They filtered this vast amount of data and broadcast a clean, godlike tactical picture directly to the F-15 seconds. The Eagle pilot was no longer a lone hunter relying on his own limited radar. He was a neuron in a collective consciousness, his situational awareness extending far beyond his own eyeballs or instruments. When he looked at his radar screen, he saw not only what his own powerful APG-63 radar detected, but what the Hawkeye saw, and what his wingmen saw. This data was fused, processed, and presented in a way that was simple, clean, and lethally effective. While a Syrian pilot was being fed sporadic and easily jammable instructions from a ground controller hundreds of miles away, the American pilot was living inside a real-time, 3-dimensional map of the entire war. This system transformed air combat from a series of individual duels into a coordinated, strategic execution. F-15 seconds could be vectored to optimal firing positions without ever turning on their own radars, guiding on the passive information fed to them by the Hawkeye. They could approach their targets silently, like submarines in the deep, only lighting them up, with their own radar in the final seconds to guide a missile. This systematic approach became the blueprint, a terrifyingly efficient meat grinder that would be deployed again, with even more devastating results, against another Soviet-equipped air force. Almost a decade later, in the cold, clear skies over Iraq in January 1991, the lesson was taught again, this time to the pilots of Saddam Hussein's Air Force. The Iraqis were, if anything, even more confident than the Syrians had been. They were equipped with the very best the Soviet Union had to offer, including the formidable MiG-29 Fulcrum. The MiG-29 was the USSR's direct answer to the F-15. It was wickedly agile, possessed a helmet-mounted sight that allowed the pilot to aim missiles just by looking at a target, and had a powerful radar of its own. On paper, it was a near-peer adversary. Iraqi pilots, many of them veterans of the long, bloody war with Iran, believed they were the best in the Arab world. They had studied the Bekaa Valley, and their Soviet advisors had assured them that new tactics and new technology had closed the gap. They were wrong. On the second day of Operation Desert Storm, Captain Jamil Sayhoud of the Iraqi Air Force climbed into the cockpit of his MiG-29, his mind a mix of patriotic fervor and professional confidence. His mission was to intercept an incoming American strike package. He and his wingmen took off from their hardened airbase and were immediately vectored west by their ground controllers. Just like in the Bekaa Valley, the plan was simple: use GCI to get into a close-range fight where the MiG-29's legendary agility could be brought to bear. As he leveled off at 20,000 feet, his cockpit instruments began to behave erratically. His radar warning receiver, which should have been silent, chattered with confusing, intermittent signals. His own radar scope was filled with phantom contacts and streaks of electronic noise. His ground controller's voice became tense, shouting contradictory headings. Captain Sayhoud scanned the sky, a perfect, empty blue. He saw nothing. He felt a growing sense of dread, the feeling of being watched by an unseen presence. He never knew that 40 miles away, Captain Cesar Rico Rodriguez, an F-15 pilot with the 36th Tactical Fighter Wing, had been tracking him for the last 3 minutes. Rodriguez saw Seyhud's MiG-29 as a simple green carrot on his tactical display. He saw his altitude, his airspeed, his heading. He watched as the Iraqi pilot flew a predictable, straight-line course, completely unaware that he was already in the crosshairs. Rodriguez received clearance from the AWACS, the more advanced successor to the Hawkeye, selected an AIM-7 Sparrow, and fired. The missile leaped off the rail, invisible to Seyhud. A few seconds later, Seyhud's headset erupted with the high-pitched, solid tone of a terminal missile warning. He had less than 5 seconds to live. He broke hard, pulling his MiG into a desperate high-G turn, but he was reacting to a ghost. He had no idea where the missile was coming from. His wingman watched in horror as Captain Seyhud's brand-new MiG-29 was violently ripped in half by the proximity-fused warhead of the Sparrow missile. The wreckage tumbled to the desert floor. The entire engagement, from initial detection to kill, had taken place from beyond visual range. The Iraqi pilot never saw his attacker. He never had a chance. This scene was repeated over and over again during the 43 days of the air war. Iraqi pilots were stunned to find themselves completely outmatched. They called the F-15 the monster. In the entire conflict, F-15 seconds would be credited with 34 confirmed air-to-air kills, the majority of them MiG 29 seconds and French-made Mirage F-1S, with 0 F-15 seconds lost in air-to-air combat. The new reality had become the norm. The age of the dogfight was over. The symbol of this new American dominance was not an object or an image, but an experience. The terrifying feeling of being hunted by an invisible predator in an empty sky. This psychological weapon was honed to perfection in the years that followed Desert Storm, during Operations Northern and Southern Watch, the enforcement of no-fly zones over Iraq. For over a decade, American and coalition aircraft, predominantly F-15 seconds, patrolled the skies, creating an invisible cage from which the Iraqi Air Force could not escape. For an Iraqi pilot, this period was a long, drawn-out psychological torture. Every day, they lived with the knowledge that the sky above their own country belonged to the enemy. Occasionally, a bold or foolish Iraqi pilot would test the boundaries. He would take off and fly towards the 33rd or 36th parallel, the invisible lines in the sand drawn by the UN. From the Iraqi pilot's perspective, it was an act of defiance. He would watch his instruments, scan the sky, and see nothing. Then, as he approached the line, his RWR would suddenly light up, first a chirp, then a steady tone. It was the Americans, announcing their presence without ever showing themselves. They were playing with him. The F-15 pilots, orbiting at high altitude, would see the Iraqi jet on their screens, watch it approach the line, and then paint it with their radar, letting the pilot know he was being watched, that he was targeted, and that he could be destroyed at any moment. The psychological impact was devastating. The Iraqi pilot, faced with the choice of certain death or humiliating retreat, would invariably turn back, his brief moment of defiance crushed. This was not warfare as they understood it. It was a constant, humiliating reminder of their own impotence. The sky, the very medium of a fighter pilot's existence, had been transformed into a source of constant dread. The recurring symbol of American power was that high-pitched electronic tone in their headset, a sound that signaled the presence of an unseen, untouchable, and omniscient foe. It was the sound of obsolescence. It was the sound of a game that had been rigged so completely that the only way to survive was not to play. The official reaction from Moscow was a study in controlled panic. In the aftermath of the Bekaa Valley, Soviet military journals and intelligence reports, now declassified, reveal a state of profound shock. The initial response was to blame the Syrians. They were poorly trained, undisciplined, and had failed to execute Soviet doctrine correctly. This was the default, face-saving explanation. But as their own technical intelligence teams examined the wreckage of downed MiGs and analyzed Israeli and American broadcasts, a more dreadful picture emerged. They were confronted with irrefutable evidence of look-down, shoot-down capabilities and beyond visual range missile shots of a consistency and reliability they had thought impossible. The Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau, the creators of the legendary MiG line, were horrified. Their entire design philosophy, built around the agile dogfighter, had been rendered obsolete overnight. They had built the world's sharpest swords, only to be confronted by an enemy who had invented the rifle. After Desert Storm, this quiet panic turned into a full-blown crisis of faith within the entire Soviet military-industrial complex. The one-sided destruction of the Iraqi Air Force, including their top-of-the-line MiG 29 seconds, could not be blamed on Arab incompetence alone. This was a systemic failure. The enemy's high command had to officially acknowledge a technology gap not of years, but of at least a generation. Their response was a frantic, desperate scramble to catch up. The Soviets realized that the fight was not in the air, but in the electromagnetic spectrum. They poured resources into developing their own AWACS-type aircraft, like the A-50 mainstay. They accelerated the development of new fighters designed from the ground up to counter the F-15, aircraft like the magnificent Sukhoi Su-27 flanker, which was designed with its own powerful radar and long-range missiles. But these were solutions for the next war, not the current one. For client states like Iraq, the realization was far more brutal and immediate. Their multi-billion-dollar air force, the pride of their nation, was little more than a collection of expensive targets. Faced with an enemy they couldn't see and a technology they couldn't counter, the Iraqis and their Soviet advisors attempted a series of desperate countermeasures, each one proving more futile than the last. Their first tactic was to try and turn the American system against itself. Knowing the F-15 seconds relied on AWACS, they theorized that if they could just shoot down that one high-value asset, the entire network would collapse. It was a sound theory, but impossible in practice. The AWACS operated hundreds of miles behind the front lines, protected by its own dedicated screen of fighter escorts. Sending MiGs after it was a suicide mission, they would be detected and destroyed long before they got anywhere close. Their next attempt was to refine their GCI tactics. Instead of one controller guiding a squadron, they assigned multiple controllers to a single engagement, hoping to feed their pilots better, more timely information to counter the Americans' situational awareness. This failed because the American electronic warfare platforms, like the EF-111 Raven and EA-6B Prowler, were not just jamming radios, they were actively listening to all Iraqi communications, predicting their moves, and sowing chaos with targeted disinformation. They were fighting an enemy that could read their minds. The most common and desperate tactic was the ambush. Iraqi pilots were ordered to fly low, using ground clutter to hide from the F-15's look-down radar. They would hug the terrain, pop up at the last second, and try to force a close-range merge where their superior numbers and the agility of the MiG-29 might give them a fighting chance. This was the tactic Captain Jamil Sayhoud was attempting on the day he died. It failed for a simple, brutal reason. The AWACS could see them anyway. The high-flying command aircraft had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire battlefield and could detect low-flying MiGs with ease. It would simply vector the high-patrolling F-15 seconds to intercept the pop-up location. The Iraqi pilot, thinking he was setting a trap, was in fact flying directly into one. The F-15 seconds refused to play the game. They would not be lured into a turning fight. They would fire their Sparrow missiles from high altitude and from a distance, then turn away, resetting the engagement. The Iraqis had prepared for a knife fight, but their opponents were systematically executing them from across the street with scoped rifles. The psychological impact on the average Iraqi pilot was nothing short of catastrophic. Morale, which had been high at the start of the war, completely collapsed. Fighter pilots, by their nature, are a confident, aggressive breed. They are trained to believe in their machines and in their own skill. That confidence was systematically dismantled, flight by flight. Pilots began to see a mission not as a chance for glory, but as a death sentence. A specific and debilitating F-15 phobia took hold. The mere mention of an F-15 on the radio was enough to cause a pilot to abort his mission. They knew that if an F-15 was in the area, they were already dead. They just hadn't exploded yet. This fear was rooted in the unknown. It's one thing to face an enemy you can see, to test your skills against his. It is another thing entirely to be stalked by an invisible force that can kill you at any moment without warning. The cockpit, once a place of power and control, became a coffin waiting for a nail. Pilots started developing mysterious mechanical problems on the flight line before takeoff. They would refuse to fly, citing maintenance issues that ground crews could never find. They knew their leaders were sending them out not to fight, but to die, to serve as little more than bait in a futile attempt to make the Americans expend a missile. The final stage of this psychological unraveling was a complete loss of faith. They lost faith in their Soviet-built aircraft, which they now saw as technologically inferior. They lost faith in their commanders, who seemed incapable of developing a workable strategy. And most devastatingly, they lost faith in their own training, the very foundation of their identity as fighter pilots. They had been trained to be masters of a forgotten art, like knights in shining armor sent to fight a tank. The ultimate result was the complete paralysis of the Iraqi Air Force. After the first few days of disastrous losses, Saddam Hussein ordered the bulk of his air force to flee to Iran, a nation he had just fought a brutal 8-year war against. It was the ultimate admission of defeat that it was safer to seek refuge with your mortal enemy than to face the American monster in your own skies. The complete and utter dominance of the F-15 and its integrated network was not simply a military victory, it was the final verdict in a decades-long ideological and industrial war. It was the ultimate expression of a uniquely American philosophy of power. The Soviet Union and its client states had built their military on a foundation of mass. They believed in quantity over quality, in the simple, rugged tool that could be produced by the tens of thousands and operated by conscripts. Their system was designed to overwhelm an enemy with sheer numbers, to trade bodies and machines in a brutal calculus of attrition. They built fighters like the MiG-21 and MiG-23 the same way they built tanks, as simple, expendable assets. This was the logical endpoint of a centralized command economy that could dictate production quotas but could not foster the kind of freewheeling innovation necessary for true technological leaps. The American system, by contrast, was built on a foundation of capital, both financial and intellectual. The F-15 Eagle was not a product of a 5-year plan, it was the result of a fiercely competitive ecosystem of private companies like McDonnell Douglas, Hughes Aircraft, and Pratt & Whitney, all vying for massive government contracts. Each component of the Eagle represented a pinnacle of specialized hyper-advanced technology. The F-100 engines were a marvel of metallurgy and thermodynamics, pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible. The APG-63 radar was a supercomputer that could perform millions of calculations per second, a feat of microprocessing that the Soviets simply could not replicate. The AIM-7 Sparrow missile was a guided weapon of incredible complexity, with its own seeker head and flight controls. Assembling all this into a single, cohesive, and reliable platform required a level of industrial precision and quality control that was the hallmark of the American aerospace industry. This approach was fantastically expensive. A single F-15 cost multiples of its Soviet counterparts. But the American calculation was different. It was a system that valued the life of its highly trained pilot and sought to multiply his effectiveness through technology. Where the Soviets would send 10 MiGs hoping 2 would get through, the Americans would send 2 F-15 seconds, confident that both would achieve their objective and return home. This was not just a difference in engineering, it was a difference in values. The F-15's cockpit, with its unparalleled visibility and intuitive controls, was designed to empower the pilot, to make him the master of the machine. The Soviet cockpit was designed to be mastered by the pilot, a complex and often unforgiving workspace for a man who was expected to simply follow orders from the ground. It was the difference between an ideology that trusted the individual and one that trusted only the state. The ultimate demonstration of what this absolute air supremacy meant took place not in the sky, but on the ground, on a 6-lane stretch of highway leading north from Kuwait City. On the night of February 26th and 27th, 1991, what remained of the Iraqi army, a vast convoy of tanks, armored personnel carriers, trucks, and looted civilian vehicles, was attempting to flee back to Iraq. They were caught in the open, in a massive traffic jam that stretched for miles. This became known as the Highway of Death. For the Iraqi soldiers trapped in that convoy, the sky, which had been a source of abstract fear, now became a literal, methodical executioner. The F-15E Strike Eagle, a 2-seat, all-weather variant of the air superiority fighter, played a key role in the carnage. Flying high above the range of ineffective anti-aircraft fire, their crews used advanced infrared targeting pods to see the desert night as if it were day. On their screens, every Iraqi vehicle glowed with a ghostly white heat. To the men on the ground, the experience was a descent into hell. They heard a faint, high-pitched whistle, a sound that grew into a terrifying scream, followed by the deafening crump of exploding bombs. Cluster munitions rained down, turning acres of desert into a maelstrom of steel shrapnel. Laser-guided bombs, directed by an invisible beam from the circling Strike Eagles, slammed into tanks with pinpoint accuracy, turning them into blazing pyres. The F-15 seconds, having established complete control of the sky, acted as airborne snipers, methodically dismantling the convoy, vehicle by vehicle. Iraqi soldiers abandoned their equipment and fled into the desert, but there was no escape. The psychological impact was absolute. This was not a battle, it was an annihilation carried out with a cold, technological precision that was utterly dehumanizing. They were not being fought by men, they were being erased by a system. The highway of death was the final, brutal proof of the F-15's victory. The air superiority won by the Eagles in the opening days of the war had enabled this moment. Because the Iraqi Air Force had been blinded, defeated, and chased from the sky, the Iraqi army was left naked and defenseless on the ground. Air power had become the decisive force, and America was its sole proprietor. In the end, the story of the F-15's triumph is an epilogue to the Cold War itself. The Soviet Union had built an ideology around the myth of the common man's struggle, of quantity having a quality all its own. They trained their pilots to be heroes, to rely on their grit and courage in the swirling chaos of a dogfight. They believed the complexities of American technology were a weakness, a sign of decadence that would fail in the crucible of real combat. They were stunned when they discovered the opposite was true. The Americans hadn't just built a better fighter, they had built a system that made the dogfight irrelevant. They had created a weapon that replaced the test of a pilot's courage with a cold, mathematical equation of detection ranges and missile intercept probabilities. The Soviet-trained pilots, who were laughed at by their instructors for fearing the flying tennis court, were ultimately vindicated. They were the ones who had to face the reality that their courage was useless, their skills were obsolete, and their aircraft were flying coffins. They never knew what hit them, because their entire philosophy of war had been predicated on a fight their enemy had no intention of having. A former Soviet aviation general, reflecting on the lessons of the Gulf War, was quoted as saying, "We always knew the Americans were ahead of us. We did not know they were on a different planet." The laughter had died in the skies over the Bekaa Valley, replaced by the chilling silence of open radio channels. The final verdict had been delivered not by politicians or treaties, but by the undeniable physics of a radar-guided missile launched from an aircraft that was, for all intents and purposes, already in the future. The monster was real, and it had proven once and for all that in the age of modern warfare, the sky belonged to the one who could see.